If you're in a dark wood on a dark night and you don't know where you are and you've never been through this territory before, you may be well advised to hire as a guide the local mad, blind old man who can feel his way through the forest, because he can do something you can't. But when the dawn breaks and the light comes, you would be silly if you continued to operate with this guide, this blind, mad old man who was doing his best with the first attempt. Religion was our first attempt to make sense of our surroundings. It was our first attempt at cosmology, for example, to make sense of what goes on in the heavens. It was our first attempt at what I care about the most, the study of literature and literary criticism. It gave us texts to deliberate and even to debate about, even if some of those texts were held to be the word of God and beyond review and beyond criticism, nonetheless the idea is introduced, and it had never been introduced before. It's our first attempt at healthcare, in one way. If you go to the shaman or the witch doctor, and you make the right propitiations, the right sacrifices, and you really believe in it, you do have a better chance of recovery. Everybody knows it's a medical fact. Morale is an ingredient in health, and it was our first attempt at that too. It was our first very bad attempt at human solidarity because it was tribe-based, but nonetheless it taught that there were virtues in sticking together. And it was our first attempt, I would say also, this is not an exhaustive list, at psychiatric care, at dealing with the terrible loneliness of the human condition, at what happens when the individual spirit looks out shivering into the enormous void of the cosmos and contemplates its own extinction and deals with the awful fear of death. This was the first attempt to apply any balm to that awful question. But, as Charles Darwin says of our own evident kinship with lower mammals and lower forms of life, we bear, as he puts it in The Origin of Species, we bear always the ineffaceable stamp of our lowly origin. I'll repeat it, the ineffaceable stamp of our lowly origin. Religion does the same thing. It quite clearly shows that it's the first, the most primitive, the most crude, and the most deluded attempt to make sense. It is the worst attempt, but partly because it was the first. So the credit can be divided in that way. And the worst thing it did was to offer us certainty, to say, these are truths that are unalterable, they're handed down from on high, we only have to learn God's will and how to obey it in order to free ourselves from these dilemmas. That's probably the worst advice of all. People say, oh, well, nothing so amazing could have happened without God. There's a name for this kind of argument, a very old and important name. It also comes largely from work at Oxford University, though it's actually attributable largely to Sir Karl Popper. It's called unfalsifiability. It's an argument you can't beat, because it isn't an argument. If you say, well, now I see how complex everything is, it would have to be God who was responsible. There's no way I can disprove that. There's no way I can falsify it. And unfalsifiability, counterintuitively, is quite rightly considered to be a test, not of the strength of an argument, but of its extreme weakness. In fact, of its non-existence as an argument. When we were on the savannah and sharing the territory and diminishing in size as a tribe ourselves, and having to bear live young in an environment full of predators, probably if we bore 8 or 9 children, some of them sickly with lolling heads and diarrhea, we wouldn't be able to pick them up and carry them and run away fast enough. It's a fact. Because it's a fact, and because it's unpleasant, and because, as Darwin says, it betrays, has with it, as everything about us does, the lowly stamp of our original origin, doesn't mean it isn't so. So the beginning of wisdom, I would say, is the recognition of what science has been able to teach us. And neither to deny that, as the rabbi does in one tone of voice, or to claim that it shows how clever God is with another tone. Make up your mind, you can't have it both ways, and actually you're wrong twice. Thanks. And the greatest obligation that you have is to keep an open mind, and to realize that in our present state, human society, we're more and more overborne by how little we know, and how little we know about more and more, or if you like, how much more we know, but how much less we know as we find out how much more and more there is to know. In these circumstances, which I believe to be undeniable, the only respectable intellectual position is one of doubt, skepticism, reservation, and free, and I'd stress free and unfettered inquiry. In that lies, as it has always lain, our only hope. So you should beware always of those who say that these questions have already been decided. In particular, to those who tell you that they've been decided by revelation, that there are handed down commandments and precepts that predate, in a sense, ourselves, and that the answers are already available if only we could see them, and that the obligation upon ourselves to debate ethical and moral and historical and other questions is thereby dissolved. It seems to me that that is the one position, it's what I call the faith position, that has to be discarded first. Now, one consequence of its man-made character, and one way of demonstrating beyond very much doubt that it is man-made, is its proliferation. We have, I think, two choices here, either man-made God or God-made man. If it's the former, nothing much remains to be explained. If it's God-made man, it's very hard to see why there are so many religions and why they're constantly at war with one another. Make the opposite assumption that man has invented religion and God, nothing is left to be explained. There is no mystery. There are, of course, innumerable proliferating cults, sects, confessional discrepancies, warring churches, schismatic groups. Most of the violence in Iraq, as we know, is not directed at our own brave soldiers and their allies among Iraqis, but at other Iraqis by other Muslims. To say that this is man-made, it seems to me to say something that's almost obvious. This kind of contemplative nonsense, turn off the mind and you'll have bliss, has ghastly consequences. The sleep of reason brings forth monsters. I try and sharpen my practice of reason, doubt, skepticism, the weighing of argument against evidence and of evidence against interest. In other words, I'm more inclined to doubt something if its truth would be something that would suit me. One of the moral superiorities of atheism, by the way, is we don't particularly want it to be true that we shall be annihilated when we die, that there's nothing to hope for from the heavens, that the heavens are empty. We don't necessarily love that idea, but we're willing to face it since the evidence for the contrary appears to be trivial or non-existent. We don't indulge in wish thinking, and we don't assert as true what we've just been asked to prove. I don't advocate that evolution is true and that the Big Bang took place. It's not part of my propaganda. I accept it. I think the evidence is overwhelming that that is in fact the case. I don't dispute it because it might be nicer to think that instead of that, there was a God who was looking out for me. I can't make myself believe something because it might be convenient to do so. Now, how difficult is this to hoist in?